Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Karen van Kluizen. I'm the Secretary General of the POLIS Network, which is the leading European network of cities and regions on urban transport innovation, as we modestly call it ourselves. Welcome to this very first Mobilising Mobility webinar. It's a brand new webinar series that we have just launched. And we decided to launch this new series following the very successful post-lockdown mobility webinar series, which ran from April until June this year and really helped our member cities and regions navigate the COVID-19 crisis from a mobility perspective. Now, while our webinars on post-lockdown mobility were only accessible to POLIS members, to the frustration of some of you, this webinar series on mobilizing mobility will be open to anyone interested. And the webinars would provide a platform for urban transport stakeholders really to learn, to discuss, and to share valuable experiences and knowledge on how to integrate new urban transport solutions in local mobility policies, thus moving from European research to actual deployment and concrete implementation on the ground. Am I the only one hearing this?
No.
I don't know.
Okay.
Oh, okay, seems to be gone. No, not. We'll see. Anyway, what the tagline of the series also says is we want to turn European transport innovation into local action. We will be showcasing transport innovation initiatives and projects in areas such as new mobility services, micromobility, automation, electromobility, public space management, inclusive mobility, data, parking, and many, many more. But before we dive into today's webinar theme, let me show you an overview of the topics that we will be featuring this month, every Tuesday and every Thursday. And we'll continue beyond this first list that you see here for several months in a row. So for those of you interested in e-mobility hubs and transport modeling, make sure to join us on Thursday. Next week, we'll be featuring the European Mobility Week and campaigning initiatives. We'll be looking at parking approaches. And then the week after will be all about inclusive mobility and embracing inclusiveness, how to make mobility work for all, basically. Now, if we move on to the next slide, then you will see my colleague Pedro Homem de Gouveia on the screen, and he's the one who will be your host and moderator for today. So I hope you will enjoy today's webinar, our first in the series, as I said, and many more to come. Over to you, Pedro. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen, and hello, everybody. Welcome. Before we take off, may we remind you of the safety instructions for this webinar. The meeting is being recorded. We hope you agree with it. The recording will be sent to you in an email after this webinar. Please keep your microphone muted when not speaking and use the Q&A box for your questions. So today we'll be talking about the consumer perspective, specifically about the consumer perspective on new mobility services. So what about the consumer? As urban mobility is more and more becoming a service, we must pay special attention to consumer rights and needs. They are building blocks for mobility policy and regulation. This brings new challenges, but also opens up new opportunities for change in policy, planning, and strategy, both for the public and the private sectors. Several conferences and webinars on new mobility services have given the stage to transport planners and researchers, policy and decision makers, authorities and operators, thinkers, funders, and entrepreneurs. But one thing is speculating about consumer preferences and needs and behavior change, and quite another is grounding that discussion in a clear view of consumer rights and actually inviting consumer organizations to the table, which is what we'll be doing here today. Policy making must consider all relevant stakeholders, as we all agree, and the discussions we have in this session will feed our work for the GECO project. A very short word about the GECO project. It's an Horizon 2020 project in which POLIS is engaged, along with a very active consortium. The project wants to support authorities in developing policy frameworks and modeling, and to help through guidance and recommendations and science-based research, help authorities develop new policies and frameworks to engage with new mobility service providers. The methodology basically stands on three elements: research on the state of play, stakeholder engagement through, for example, workshops, focus groups, online service and webinars like this, and regulatory supportive tools. If you would like to know more, please check the website right here, sorry, h2020-gecko.eu, or contact us at POLIS, and we'll be very happy to share with you all that we have. Now, for our speakers today, about the consumer perspective, we invited three very good-looking and smiling speakers. They are, number one, Robin Loos from Sustainable Transport Office from the Bureau Européen des Unions des Consommateurs, or BEUC, the European Consumer Organization. Robin is a former consultant in EU public affairs and car legislation, and was a former assistant to a political group at the Belgian Federal Parliament in charge of mobility and transport and new technologies. He's an active user of new mobility services. He doesn't own a car. Olivier Lenz is Programs Director for the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile, or FIA, Region 1. He's responsible for research projects and multi-stakeholder cooperation. He manages various aspects of mobility policy work related to affordable and connected driving, as well as road safety and environmental protection from the consumer perspective. He coordinates advocacy towards the European institutions and private stakeholder interests, and he previously worked in the FIA Mobility Division in Paris, where he was responsible for developing the organization's public affairs presence at a global level. And finally, Evelien Marlier, project manager at the European Passengers Federation, EPF. Her mission is to campaign for effective multimodal travel by conducting research and working constructively with the transport industry and decision makers. She focuses on user experience and involves end users to evaluate products and services. Her personal motto is "Get people moving," which is not only part of her job at EPF, but also as a dance teacher in her free time. So this session will develop as a panel discussion. We'll be asking our guests questions, tough questions, and everybody's most welcome to the Q&A box, and also to pose further questions. So everybody ready? I will stop sharing the screen so we can look at each other. And let's do this. So for the first question, I would ask Robin, straight away, can consumer policy help clean transport in Europe? What do you say?
Hello everyone. First of all, good not to see people, but good to talk to people in these weird times. Thanks for having me, and thanks for organizing this webinar. Regarding your question, from my side, it's a big yes. Consumer policy is quite large. Obviously, there are various ways to target consumers, but engaging consumers in the profound changes that we need is essential. First of all, if you look at the numbers, transport is a major part of any household budget. It costs a lot, and it costs even more for less affluent consumers. So it makes sense to find affordable solutions for all of these people. People who first want to move around safely and on time. If you look at the pyramid of what consumer needs, is to arrive on time at destination in a safe and timely way. But people are also willing to change their behavior. They understand the fact that climate change is coming faster than ever, and that there are sustainable solutions, but they are not affordable yet. And as a citizen living in Brussels, I can only tell you, nobody here wants to go back to pre-pandemic pollution levels. So people do understand the issues here. So there are a lot to be done. And I can give you a couple of examples from a consumer perspective of why this can really help achieving major changes. Information, first of all. Electric cars are rising, the sales of electric cars are rising, and yet lots of people don't know what actually is an electric car, how to charge it, what are different plugs, what are the price, what is the real price of a car. We have seen that many people cannot really estimate the price of car ownership. We have studies proving that in a medium term, electric cars can be cheaper than fossil-fueled ICE vehicles. But we have to go that way, and we have to inform citizens what is the actual price of fuel, how can you charge easily in electric cars, and giving them, which is my second point, the right price signal. there are many tools for politicians and especially the EU, but also at local level here at cities, to implement purchase incentives, tax cuts, mobility premiums, and a really sustainable road pricing scheme that can help consumers have the right impact. Because money drives us all, and at some point we need to find solutions that we can pay, all right? But I understand from a consumer perspective, getting taxes on is also quite difficult message to pass on. But again, if you earmark the revenue, if you're transparent, if you're fair in the way you implement taxes, or on the other side, purchase incentives, people will get on board with the change that are needed, especially within main cities. And of course, at a broader scale, if you look at what consumer actually needs, getting back to electric cars, for example, you need to tackle range anxiety. People obviously will charge their electric cars at home. They will need infrastructure when they go shopping, when they go visit their grandma or whatever. So a high quality of services will make a difference for passengers, either by investing in public transport, punctuality, reliability, and all the other alternatives in sustainable ways to move around cities.
Yeah, good. Evelien, Robin touched on a point here. He said at some point there are affordable solutions, but there are sustainable solutions, but they're not affordable yet. You know, many people are kind of locked in car dependence. That is, other transport options are much more costly for them in terms of time, convenience, and safety, and they've built their routines around their car. On the other hand, many others are capped. They don't have enough money to afford other options. So as we consider sustainability, should multimodality be a consumer's right? And if yes, how can we make it happen? Do you have any idea?
Well, I believe so. I think we should evolve towards more multimodal transfers in Europe, but also in cities. And indeed, it's really hard to change people's travel behavior because people are stuck in patterns, and you need actually life-changing events. Like now, the COVID period is actually a really good moment to try out new things. Also, we see that people are willing to change travel behavior when they have other important life-changing events, like having a kid or moving. So these are really the moments where you can capture the attention of citizens and try new things. But indeed, sometimes citizens need a gentle push, or how we call it, a nudge. We need to nudge them towards to even let them try new things. And that's also something we see. So if we really want car drivers to try alternatives, then you must make sure that these alternatives are convenient, safe, that's really important these days, comfortable and available. And indeed, well, some people don't have the resources to try out a lot of new things, to have subscription for a lot of modes. So if we can provide them really good integrated solutions, then we can lower the threshold for them. We could, for instance, like one of the things you might suggest is to have different prices for people that belong to certain vulnerable groups. Like people that are unemployed, or people that that are PRMs, people with reduced mobilities, for example. So this can also help them to try new things. And also the services must be right. If you want to, like people with reduced mobility, if you want them to try out public transport, for example, then you need to be sure that there is right assistance and, of course, good information provision. Information provision, communication is also key to gain passengers or citizens' trust. And definitely now, in these times, we really need to regain the customers' trust if we want them to push them towards these more sustainable transport modes.
I was wondering, Olivier, if FIA could play a role there. You know, does FIA also believe multimodality should be a consumer's right? First question. And we also hear a very interesting thing is that automobile clubs are becoming mobility clubs. Is that true? And what's driving that change?
Yeah, thank you, Pedro, and thank you for the invitation to POLIS again. I think it's a very interesting debate and interesting questions that you're asking. Is multimodality right? I would reformulate that. I would say that it's an opportunity. I think that our society is changing a lot due to different factors, and let's say there are different trends, but also technologies, there are new enablers. And I think this is a great opportunity to change our way of being mobile on, let's say, making it safer, more sustainable, more flexible, and more adapted to our modern life. Mm-hmm. So I would go for the opportunity, and to me the question is really, let's say, which areas can we use to innovate and to bring new services and to improve the mobility services and to make them let's say adapted to our needs. And I think there the mobility clubs are certainly let's say one of the actors next to public transport, cities, of course, to, let's say, to push these new innovations forward. And I think, as I said, there are different things. Our life patterns are changing. Generally, life is, let's say, speeding up. People want to do more in a day. They would like to be flexible. And let's say, while, let's say, in their connected life, they are everywhere at the same time, and they would also, let's say, in physical life, be, let's say, to have the possibility of, let's say, having different activities. And I think that there are two different elements that are playing. One is connectivity, and there are a lot of, let's say, services which existed before but were much more difficult to organize. And that through connectivity, they are now much easier to organize, like, for instance, vehicle sharing. That is, let's say, has in the last 2-3 years really boomed through the use of connectivity technologies, the fact that we are all on the internet, we have mobile phones and so on. I also think that, let's say, we are getting more international. We are used to travel across border, and they are also, let's say, to follow this trend. Mobility transport has to follow this trend, going towards, for instance, international route planners, or also ticketing must be international, must be cross-modal as well. So there we are thinking about mobility as a service, but then, let's say, beyond the city, beyond the country, even beyond the region. I think that's very important to consider this. Of course, the city is where most people live, but they would also like to go out of the city or to come to the city, and so this needs to be integrated.
Yeah, I would ask maybe all of you for a quick question. You know, unemployment is rising, and we have a long-term economic recession in the horizon, to be realistic. And people will need affordable mobility options now more than ever, maybe. Not one option, but several options. And, you know, how can we promote affordability in urban transport? I mean, is it just public transport, or is there a way that we can bring, that you feel for consumers, that we can bring more mobility options into this affordable spectrum? Who would like to start? Robin, go ahead.
Yeah, so I would say it's a very interesting question, because I think what we are lacking, and what we've been lacking for the last couple of years, is the situation is as it is. We have plenty of new mobility options, bike sharing, ride sharing, lots of new apps, but we were lacking a structure. And this structure has to go back to public transport. This has to be, what can I do with a bus, a train, a tram, a metro? And on the side of this structure, where else can I go at a cheap and affordable price? And that structure is essential, because you can't just let the magic happen, the magic of new mobility services. Plenty of them will arrive and plenty of them will die. And if you don't get on board with them, to provide them with the right incentives to target the consumers where they actually live and where they actually work, where are their leisures, then you're missing the point, and you will just end up with a solution where you have a huge competition, which is true and helpful in terms of pricing, but they won't be sustainable in the future and in the long term, just because many of these new apps are starting to die because of too much competition and a lack of structure. So I would say that would be the main basis of a transport system within cities. And then you can get on with more affordable solutions, because the market is safe and sound, and people can move around using lots of new mobility services.
Yeah. Evelien, do you also think of public transport as the backbone, as the key to move in that direction?
I believe that's true. Well, and indeed, integration, both on a digital level and on a operational level, physical level, is really of utmost importance. We can use the public transport as a backbone, but then all these new mobility services, micro-mobility services that can serve the first and last mile, that be the first and last mile solution, must be integrated too. Because now there's so much fragmentation, and it's so hard for a user, definitely when you're moving around in a city that you don't know so good, to see what's there. It's sometimes there's such a big offer that it's really hard to decide what is the best for you. And then indeed you need a policy to nudge people towards the good things. I think that local policymakers, city governments have the things in their hands that they can really force shifts towards more sustainable by cooperating with the private sector. They need to take actually the best things from the private sector and integrate it in their and in a sense create a sandbox in which everyone can play, but following the rules. And the rules should be at least that the new mobility or the operators share their data, because for citizens and customers, it's so important to have real-time information about a lot of things. And also to be sure that there are positive impacts. So not that new mobility services take customers away for public transport. That's not the way to go forward. So these are definitely at least two conditions that needs to be met. I've seen at the Gecko website that there are also already some really good suggestions made and some documents that are with some good practices. So I think people can also take a look there and learn.
Yeah, I would go back to Olivier, because the issue I have with public transport being the backbone is that it's if suddenly everybody who's driving a car now would jump on the public transport, the system would just crumble. The capacity isn't there. And to grow the capacity really requires massive public investment, for which availability also isn't there. And so, we have to grow the capacity. As we all agree, we have to offer alternatives. But to offer alternatives, we have to grow the capacity. And to grow the capacity, we have to look for other ways that do not rely only on public investment and long investment cycles. So that's why I thought was really interesting the idea of FIA coming up with these mobility clubs. Sorry to massacre you with a question, Olivier. I don't want to massacre you. But the question is that, here, and taking again what Robin says, we have to target the consumers where they are. So how do we reach and provide new opportunities to everybody who's stuck in a suburban car commute pattern? what kind of things could your mobility clubs do for them?
I think the first element, and it has already been said, I think it's information, is to know what are the different options and what is appropriate for me. I think that's absolutely important. But before coming to the information, it's important to, let's say, to offer the different alternatives and to have appropriate solution for, let's say, every need. Basically, I mean, public transport to go to do groceries is probably not the right solution. Like visiting grandma in the countryside with public transport is not the right solution. Going to the cinema in the city by car is not the right solution. So basically, it's really finding let's say the right service that corresponds to the need. And there, I think what will play an important role is the combination of different modes of transport, different services. And then, let's say, once that's being developed, to complement that with the right information, creating the trust, because I think that's very important. Often now, it's, let's say, the car mobility gives you, let's say, a certain trust that you will, let's say, you know where you start, you know where you arrive, you know, let's say, depending on congestion, how long it will take you. And I think this trust is very important. And there, let's say, what clubs are doing is that they are developing a number of services in order to help you to gain this trust in different alternatives, to show you, let's say, what are the benefits and, let's say, advantages, disadvantages of different solutions. I mean, just to give you, let's say, an example, I mean, I was speaking about mobility as a service. I mean, the fact that there is somebody who takes responsibility for your journey from A to Z, and probably will come also to the, let's say, to the traveler rights. Let's say, an easy solution where you know that when you start the journey, you will have tickets everywhere without that. Maybe you have to worry about, oh, do I have the right credit card? Do I have to write this? Do I have to write that? Maybe if you travel abroad, you don't speak the right language, and so on. So basically, there are a number of tools which are developed by cities, by public transport operators or other operators, but also by mobility clubs. And I think we are all looking a bit for the same solutions, because it's let's say, it's quite clear what is needed from a consumer perspective. It's just a way of, let's say, matching on one side the trends with the technology, and then to find, let's say, the appropriate services that go with it. Mm-hmm. So to me, it's really a combination of all of those things, and it would be too easy to say, let's move let's say, the motorists to the public transport. That's also in terms of affordability, that's not always the right solution. Public transport comes with a high cost, which is partly borne by society, partly borne by the users. But if it's not the right appropriate service, then it has quite a high cost, both in terms of, let's say, the price you pay, but also in terms of comfort and so on.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, let's move to passenger rights. You know, Robin, maybe we could take this one. We usually associate passenger rights with longer travel by plane, train, boat, etc. But urban travel implies many short trips. And as new offers like shared micromobility emerge and grow, and as we talk more and more about MaaS, which is could be combining several short trips, how can we consider passenger rights in the context of short urban trips? Are there any?
There are a lot, and it's true, as you said, we mainly focus on trains and planes, but when it comes to urban trips, passenger rights are important, and they're mainly related to a couple of things: access to personal data and digital rights, basically. What are these new services doing with my data? What if the startup I'm using to ride a bike, to share a bike, crashes and stops delivering services? And what if I paid in advance? What happens with my money? What happens with my data that I shared with this new app, this new mobility services? And also, and to me, it is the key element here, is the question of accessibility and the territorial and social exclusion that these new services can lead to. Taking an example, here in Brussels, you have a bike sharing mobility app, which is called Billy. And they've been meeting a lot with the government about how to improve the experience they provide to consumers. And what we've been realizing is that this app, which is a rational economic thinking, have been developing itself in the south of Brussels, where richer people live. The whole northern part of Brussels has been completely opted out of this economic pattern. And it's sad itself because it creates more inequality. People from the north of Brussels are already lacking public services, such as metro, trams, and buses services. So here, and local authorities have a great power is to encourage these new mobility services and new mass to get on board and kind of dictate what is a sustainable mobility solution in a city, meaning controlling the fleet, the amount of vehicles, of bikes or cars or trottinettes or whatever, controlling the amount of vehicles you put in the streets, targeting the commune, the neighborhoods which are lacking these services. And this is, to me, key. And also, when you're talking about digital rights and social exclusions, let me remind that many people don't use the internet. Lots of people have an iPhone or a smartphone, but are lacking the key competences to use them. And why should they be left aside? And here again, public authorities have the capacity to create what people are used to, a mobility card that can be accessible to everyone and that can be used for several services. It's a matter of integration and to get multimodality as a public thing rather than letting all the new mobility apps competing by themselves, as I said, without a structure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed, what's driving the public and the private initiative is rather different. And, you know, beyond info exclusion, social exclusion, Evelien, this idea that we need to accelerate the shift towards sustainable mobility. And well, public-private partnerships, as mentioned, can be a way to grow those alternatives. But this will, you know, progressively blur the lines between public and private services. You know, when we blur these lines, what do you feel are the key risks and opportunities for consumers?
Well, one of the key risks might be if you take over Google, for example, that they will push forward for people using an e-scooter as the best mode to reach your destination, whereas actually it would be better for you to walk and cycle. So I think it's really the role of the authorities and also of everyone, also the citizens, to make sure that you also take this societal impacts into account. And so we really need to internalize the external costs too. And this is something that needs to be done by the policymakers in the first place. But as I said, it's also everyone's responsibility. But I think besides risks, like one private company that will gain a monopoly, lack of competition is also another risk that might occur. I think there's also a lot of opportunities that can rise. I mean, we could work like we see now that there's a lot of transport poverty in certain suburban and rural areas. And I think that if a better cooperation between these public-private partnerships, that we can solve this. Like if you provide a procurement for one of the new mobility services in the city center, then they should also be sure or grant them subsidies that they also operate in the suburbs, so that people living there can also reach, have the same accessibility to education, to health, to job opportunities. And this is really, really important for the people to, indeed, to make modes, and definitely on the digital level to make them accessible to all and inclusive to all.
Mm-hmm.
And well, coming back to the passenger rights, Robin already mentioned that it's really important to have those. At this moment on an EU level, we don't have multimodal passenger rights. We have them for several modes, and even then, they're not always, even though they exist, they're not always enforced. So I'm really sure that if people know that if they are taking, taking a combination of modes during one trip, and they are better protected definitely when something goes wrong, people will be more willing to try these things, because it's now, when you in your car and your car breaks down and you have an insurance, yeah, you just have a call and someone can help to fix your car. But if you're there well, your train isn't running anymore, or you have missed your transfer, what to do then? And people need to be reassured at the time. They need to have information also offline. So if their telephone is dead, they have a plan B, and that's really important. So you're only as strong as the weakest link. So in order to regain the trust, or try seduce people to move towards more sustainable, then they need to be better protected. And at this moment, unfortunately, that's not the case in many cases. Yes.
Mm-hmm. So to seduce people to shift to more sustainable mobility, reassurance,
yeah,
is important. And
yeah, better protection.
Yeah.
Yeah, being sure that they will get money, of that they at least arrive at home or at their destination. That's so important.
Yeah, Olivier, keeping on user behavior, you know, we've talked about seducing, and I think that's a very important point of this webinar today. You know, seducing user behavior change through a reassurance, trust that you've all mentioned. But you know, we have to do more, and we have to work faster to deal with the climate crisis. That means not just promoting, but actually accelerating the shift towards sustainable mobility. Campaigns don't seem very effective, at least not effective enough for the speed of change that we need. Maybe it's not enough to appeal to individual responsibilities, and we have to be more forceful. You know, how far can we go? What are the feelings at FIA regarding this?
Yeah, I think at the end, the best way of convincing people to, let's say, to change their behavior is to offer alternatives, to offer appropriate solutions. I think that's the best. And on the other side, to inform them. So that's what we said in the beginning. I think that in terms of information, I mean, we spoke earlier about electrification, for instance. People are very unsure of, let's say, what it entails, how it works, what it costs, and so on. And so, just to give you a few examples, what some mobility clubs have developed is, for instance, let's say, offering the opportunity to test the vehicle for some time. So you get an electric vehicle for a few days, for a week or so, and you can try it. You can try how it works in your daily life and how, let's say, it serves the purpose it should serve. I think that's a very good way of convincing people by just, let's say, doing an information campaign and telling people take an electric vehicle. People will not be convinced. So I think that's a very good way. Then advising consumers in general, but also explaining to them what it entails, how it works. But then, for instance, some mobility clubs approach companies. I mean, a lot of our mobility is between home and our work, and approaching companies and advising them on the mobility of their staff can also help to, let's say, to change behavior and to create this trust. So that's sort of the information. On the other side, I mean, as I said, let's say the trust is very important. Coming back to electrification, I mean, now people buy new cars, new electric cars. And why is that the case? Because it's, let's say, it's quite a new technology. In a few years, those cars will be in the second-hand market. And due to the fact that the battery has an extremely high value and doesn't really show what is its status, and so it's quite difficult to, let's say, to handle this in the second-hand market. There again, it's very important to create this trust. And what mobility clubs, for instance, do is that they offer diagnostics of second-hand cars, and especially for electric vehicles. They will inspect the battery, and they will say, okay, this battery is, let's say, still in a good state or less good state or so, and that could be the value of this vehicle, which is sometimes a bit more difficult than with the traditional types of motorizations. So that's another way of creating this trust. I think it's very important to convince people rather than just telling them to do something, because, let's say, if they don't understand it or they are not sure about it, they will not move, and I think that's understandable.
Yeah. Well, still on the topic of information and cost. You know, you've probably read this article was published in Nature last month that shows, you know, how this recently published research shows how car owners tend to underestimate the costs of their private cars, but really underestimate. And it also shows the same article that more accurate information could significantly influence shift towards more sustainable solutions, like, you know, all of you were kind of saying. My question is, you know, should European consumers be better informed, or are they well informed already? I mean, is there something that we could work together on in terms of policy? Is the European Union doing enough already? Who wants to start?
Yeah. Yeah, consumer information, again, key aspect. If we take your example of electric cars, what's happening now when you're buying a car? You have information displayed on WLTP, NEDC, CO2 emissions. You don't really know how many NOx your car will emit. You have information that you can compare on various websites, some of them being held by manufacturers. So you're kind of swimming in a lot of information, that is true, but is that information really reliable and up to date? Big example of what the EU can do and has to do pretty fast is revising the car labeling directive. When you buy a car, you should see straight ahead with on-road testing how much it will emit, how much it costs to run for 5, 10, 15 years. And that, for the moment, is not the case. The car labeling legislation is back from 1999, more than 20 years old. And there were no electric cars back then. There were no new technologies. So that is one thing that could be done on the sales side. On the other side, and maybe also what cities can achieve, is providing information on where the chargers are, what kind of plugs people need, what is it to actually charge an electric car? And that allows me just to make a quick point on that, because we say a lot of what we have to do, and it's also a matter of public resources. Do the cities have the resources to have one guy able to understand the data from new mobility services, to aggregate them, to share them to the public? It's a big issue as well, because of course everyone knows what we have to do, but do we have the resources, especially at local level, to inform consumers properly? And that, I'm sure there is a lot of work to do from the EU level to help local governments to inform better.
Yeah. Olivier, Evelien, would you like to take this on?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on this. This is for us a very essential point. It's very important. It's about informing, let's say, not only giving the information, but making sure that the information arrives. Let's say that it's understandable. So it's also a matter of communication more than information. And it's also very important that this information is correct. I mean, you mentioned about CO2 and the legislation, which is quite old, but it's also the CO2 is based on tests which are outdated. So they have been recently updated through the WLTC, replacing the NEDC. So I think a lot of work is done there. But it's also, you mentioned, Robin mentioned NOx. So I think that it's very important that the tests which are carried out, that they are trustful, and we have seen with the diesel scandal that this has not been the case, and this has destroyed consumer trust in the information that they receive. So I think that this is extremely important, all these elements. Let's say as mobility clubs, we have developed different tools. I think Robin is absolutely right in saying that the labeling needs to be improved. At the moment, it has been quite messy because it has been implemented in different ways in different European countries. Let's say there again, in terms of information, it was maybe not bad, but in terms of communication, it was not good. But then what we have been working on is on the quality of the information, and we have been initiating a program which is called Green NCAP, so Green New Car Assessment Program, like for the Euro NCAP for the safety. So comparing different vehicles in terms of emissions, and let's say developing very trustful information, going beyond what is legally required, because it's, let's say, one element is certainly the legal requirement, but the other one is also to create a competition in the market, to show to consumers that you can do better than what the regulation requires. So I think all these elements are very important, and as mobility clubs, we have been supporting all of that. And we hope that in future years, with this information, with the communication around it, and with the fact that this information will be correct and trustful, that we can establish the trust of consumers, and therefore also, let's say, influence their purchasing behavior, their behavior in general to this. And next to that, there's, of course, we should not forget about eco-driving. I mean, a number of initiatives that people can also take in order to influence let's say, the way they are mobile. And eco-driving goes beyond just driving. It's about mixing different modes of transport, using public transport, micro-mobility, and so on. And all this, let's say, to be perfect, should be combined, and let's say this information should be communicated, so that for each trip I can, let's say, as consumer, I can decide, let's say, which option I choose, knowing, let's say, what it costs, let's say, in financial terms, but also, let's say, the comfort it gives me, the speed, but also the environmental aspect. So all of this should be combined and communicated. And I think like that we will convince users, consumers, to make the right choice, which is, let's say, appropriate for them.
Evelien, do you dream of a future where passengers can make their travel choices, urban mobility choices, based on correct assessments of their carbon footprint? A bit like we see in the airplane tickets, you know, how much carbon our travel will emit. Is that a viable and desirable future?
Well, I believe that the people should still have a bit of freedom to choose what they prefer. But I think that in the near future, people are more willing to go for more sustainable solutions. We also see now that people like the revolve of the night trains, for example. That's also a really nice evolution. But indeed, maybe people should realize it even more. Indeed, not everyone is aware of their footprint.
Mm-hmm.
And then the combination of carrot and stick methods should be key indeed. And I think like you should make the use of sustainable transport modes as easy as possible and most polluting as difficult as possible. And you can, like in an urban area, can really facilitate active modes, for example, through dedicating more bike lanes. Like now the reallocation of public space is a really nice example. Investing in infrastructure, or if you say, hey, you need to pay more if you are using your own private car, but then it should be immediately, all these extra resources should be really going to better infrastructure, like for indeed, like I said, better public transport, better safe pedestrian areas. So people see where the money is going to. And I think if people know that, then they're will be more willing to try new things or to pay a bit more, because we see now that not everyone is willing to pay more to make use of sustainable modes. There are big, like I think 35% of people is willing to pay more, but even 65 not. But if they are made aware that the money goes to a purpose that serves them all, and definitely their children, then I think big benefits can be made, and big leaps forward can be made.
Okay, dear speakers, last question. Surprise question. No, the question is, so we had the great attendance for the session and great interest on the part of cities and on many of the new mobility service operators that we usually interact with. So my last question is very simple for each of you. So there is an interest in thinking and integrating consumer policy and consumer rights as we think, plan, and strategize about the future of urban mobility. What is your word of advice for cities? How can we best do it? And so what is your word of advice for cities and also for some new mobility service operators that are watching this webinar? Who would like to start?
Well, maybe I...
Yes, go ahead.
I think the best way to go forward is by really involving the citizens and try to make sure that everyone is represented. So not only the representatives of the people, but really the people themselves. So everyone is the requirements of all people are taken into account. So user-centric design, applying universal design methodologies and manuals is really, really important to go forward. So I think that would be my main advice.
Okay, next.
Yeah, I can go next. Yeah, I just follow what you just said, Evelien. I also think that, let's say, users, consumers of mobility should be put at the center of policy. I think that's most important, and that's not always the case at the moment. So I think that's very important. I think that, let's say, all aspects need to be taken into account. So it's not only, let's say, a question of it has to be affordable, or it has to be sustainable, or it has to be safe also, but it has to be all of those factors at the same time. And of course, let's say, there should be a balance between all of them. I think also there's not one silver bullet. Let's say, there are different solutions for different needs. And let's say policy needs to be inclusive, so it's taking into account the needs of different types of consumers. I mean, we spoke about, for instance, elderly people or people with reduced mobility, so their interests need to be taken into account as well. And then especially for cities, I think it's very important also to take into account the needs from those people who do not live in the cities and who come to cities. So it's, let's say, cities should not only care for their own or the interests of their own people, but also take into account the interests of the people coming. And that's often, let's say, is not the case when we see how, let's say, the mobility of people commuting to cities is let's say, very difficult. So I think all of those interests need to be taken into account, and sometimes I understand that for cities it's difficult to take all of those interests into account, but I think that that's needed.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Robin?
Olivier made the right point. Big job ahead for cities. They have a lot of responsibilities. It's a chance, an opportunity, but it can also be dramatic if the general or national government is mistrusted by the public. So I think they have a good shot to play, because people do believe in their local authorities more than ever, because they realize what the state cannot do anymore. So I would argue that local management is like a project management. Say what you're doing, involve everyone, get the private on board with the public authorities, try to create something that people can understand, can see, can taste. And as Olivier said, make your city something that is viable for everyone coming in, coming out, living in the city, coming for work. I think that's the main message. If you create coherence and try to build a project that is understandable, which is what we are lacking for the moment at the political level, people will get on board.
Okay. And with those wonderful words of wisdom, before we go, give me just 1 second. Okay, is everybody seeing my screen, right? Okay. So these were our speakers for the day. Thank you for attending this session. Don't forget, the next webinar in the Mobilizing Mobility series is scheduled for Thursday. It will be about e-mobility hubs. And finally, before you say goodbye, mindful of the needs and the comfort of the consumers of this session, may we invite you to use the 3 remaining minutes before your next appointment. And here's our contribution. Thank you, take care, and see you Thursday.